I could move to our first panel event, Gender Balance Champions. Joining me are Paul Pullman, the CEO and founder of Imagine, the former CEO of Unilever, and one of the original founders of the UN's He for She. Jane Wakely, the lead CMO of Mars, and Luisa Delgado, an investor, a portfolio board member on the board of IKEA, AO World, and others, and an ex-CEO of a major optical company, Safilo. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Now, of course, you're all known champions of gender balance and equality. And I'd like you to share what's your biggest achievement in this area, maybe what's your top tip, and maybe what's the toughest barrier you've had to overcome. Jane, if I could start with you. Oh, Jane, you're on mute. You're on mute, that phrase of 2021.
Sorry, has to happen, doesn't it? Thanks, Anne. Good evening, everyone. It's really lovely to connect with so many P&G alumni again. So look, I work for Mars Inc. and I think it's always important to celebrate progress. So we're proud of progress, things like having pay equity, things like being recognized with a rating of 100% from the Corporate Equality Index in the US, from the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. But the reality is, progress isn't sufficient, and we're very, very far still from our goals. So for example, you know, we've committed that we want 100% of our leadership teams to be gender balanced. And at the moment, we're at about 43%. So as I reflect on, you know, what we've learned in that journey, and we've learned from the progress, but we've learned from also the challenge, I think it's a combination of actions. On the one hand, you've got the big, bold, systemic actions that raise the floor of the whole company. But my real tip, it's also on the individual actions. And I think I've been super inspired to meet very many role models in our business who just decide to act on the thing closest in their sphere of control. And by making those actions, not needing big policy, it begins to create momentum towards the big goals. So on the big, bold vision, you know, let's take 100% gender balanced leadership teams. Like any business strategy, you know, what it comes is you set your vision, you set a target, you measure, you really course correct when you're off track. And I think the big tip I'd have there is what we don't do enough on some of these issues is really listen to the root cause of the issue. So we just launched a big initiative called Here to Be Heard. And it's amongst internal associates, but it's also amongst women right throughout our supply chain to speak up and to share what's holding them back, what they think needs to be different. And of course, it's inclusive of men too. And some of the bold initiatives we're sort of taking that I'm most proud of are things like gender equality on parental leave. So however you come to be a parent, whatever your gender choice, every associate, for example, in the UK Mars has the right to equal parental leave, 52 weeks leave, 26 weeks, paid at 90%. And those bold innovations that really push the agenda and really seek to address the root cause of gender equality, I think are amazing. But on the other hand, as I said, it's the individual personal actions. And I want to tell a little story about one of my personal heroes at Mars called Fiona Dawson. Because for me, she's role modeled. Yes, she champions the big, bold strategy and the big, bold innovation, but she also takes those really important individual decisions that break the norm, that break the unconscious bias. And the one I'd like to tell is I will never forget when we first, we did a panel together and we were appointing a marketing VP for the UK. And basically there was an outstanding candidate, but she was crystal clear. She only wanted to work 3.5, maybe 4 days a week. And in those days, the company policy was absolutely, you know, no, for those big jobs, you had to be highly visible, highly available. Fiona was the one that championed, we were better off to appoint Mitch because she was going to make the biggest difference. And she put her own reputation on the line that let's measure the performance, let's make it work, and let's make it happen. And for me, it's those individual heroic actions that also are vital in driving change. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. And actually, Paul, there's a lot of themes there that are going to resonate with you. And, you know, you did a lot of this at Unilever some time ago, or perhaps a bit of a pioneer. Can you share your reflections?
Well, thanks, Anne. And it's obviously an honor to be on the panel with Jane. I work a lot with Grant, and Mars is a great company. And then with Luisa also. Luisa and I were both partners in crime in Europe when we were driving diversity. And it's a real pleasure to see you. It's also one of my first reappearances at a P&G alumni event. For some reasons that I've forgotten, I was absent for the last 10, 12 years and had a great time. But it is great to connect and see friends like Otmar and all the others back on the screen. It looks like I'm the only one that got older when you guys are all staying young. So I should have retired from P&G probably and not hop around other companies. Anyway, I'm in the Netherlands right now because my 92-year-old mother unfortunately got a stroke. And I was just telling her that I was in this event. But it also dawned on me how grateful I am, and obviously how much I have to thank my mother for where I am and who I am and the possibilities that were given to us. She actually was a teacher, but when she started to get children in the early or mid 50s, she had to stop working. That were the norms in those days. But she insisted that we do our homework and that we make things, strive to the highest level of performance. And reflecting on her life and seeing her there as a proud woman, I think there's no better testimony than dedicating this podcast, at least from my side, to her. I don't have many achievements that I would be personally proud of, because I think that many of the things that have been achieved are actually because they have been distributed achievements. I firmly believe, and the reason why I fight for LGBT or for the rights of people with disabilities or for gender, is not that I like one or the other. It is just that I firmly believe that society can only function if we defend the basic values of dignity and respect for everybody, equity, compassion. And the moment, as we've seen in some of the political leaders, we start violating these basic values, we undermine bit by bit actually the future of humanity. So this is a bigger issue than just gender balance, if you want to. At Unilever, the first thing I did when I came in, unfortunately, I found a board without gender balance and an organization that had about 38% of gender balance in the company. We immediately changed our board to a 50-50 gender balance, but also racial. We had 2 people from Africa, 2 from China, and the gender balance was immediately achieved. And that made such a difference. It changed the conversations in the board, but it also gave us the courage and direction to work it in the company. And over a 10-year period, which was exactly my tenure as CEO there, we moved the gender of management at all levels actually from 38% to 50%. And I don't think still there are many companies that have achieved that. And it's a shame. It's a shame. I think some of the things that I believe in is that gender balance is not in your office or in your own environment or in your department. It is in everything you do in life, which also means it is in your value chain. If you don't bring it into what some people might call scope 3 instead of scope 1 and 2, if we compare it to climate change, you won't get there. We were ensuring that we would create 2.5 million jobs for women in our value chain, that the supervisors on our tea plantations were as many women as men, that we had suppliers which fairly represented this equality as best that we could. So the gender lens has to go into everything. You cannot bifurcate it and celebrate one thing, but then terribly fall short on the other. That is an important thing. The second thing is that you have to work on things, I believe, to be credible as leaders that go beyond your self-interest. Everybody can make the case that your company would be more profitable, that it's good for your shareholders, that a more diverse company is more creative. But frankly, important as it may be, I think you are really a leader if you start working on the broader changes. And what I've especially liked is the work we've done with UN Women, the work we've done to unstereotype things in advertising, the work we've done with farmers in the value chain where most of the poverty is, the work we've done on developing the Sustainable Development Goals. and not only having goal number 5 in there of gender balance, but permeating through all of the 17 goals. And now, obviously, in COVID, we're working on ensuring that more disproportionate attention goes to women and girls which have suffered. So my very simple tips in one sentence, Anne, if I may, is set bold targets for sure, as Jane was saying, but build your gender lens in everything you do. Then it's not about gender balance. It's actually about these values, which is racial inequality of disability, gender. You can't pick one or the other and be seen as sincere. And then finally, get it embedded in the behaviors in your cultures, but it starts with yourself.
Some really great advice there and a really integrated and holistic approach. Now, Luisa, you've had what you've described as a mosaic career, done C-suite, investor, board. What are some of your experiences on this topic?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anne. It's a real great pleasure to be here. Also, I have not been in the P&G circuit, I think, since 2007, no, 12 actually, I think. And I'm really delighted to see a lot of familiar faces and a series of them whom I got to know well exactly in diversity work. Paul, more than diversity, but diversity for sure, but also many others. And it's interesting to see, you know, how the world has moved on and how many things have stayed the same. I think that's perhaps one of the insights, which is particularly true, I think, for diversity. Many of the conversations continue to be exactly the same as in 1998 that I would have had with Claude Meyer when I started to be his diversity guru. And I have no idea what qualified me for that beyond being a woman, but I learned enormously, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this later. I think my key insight, to build on what Jane and Paul said and add on something new, I think my key insight on diversity as a topic of values and of approach is that it is about seeing the unique differences that a diverse set of people can make. It's not about gaps, but difference is a plus, not a minus. And therefore, when difference is a plus, it brings in some more than the sum of its parts. And I think this is very important. I'd like to actually dedicate this, this event to the mountains. I'm here in St. Moritz, deeply snowed in. I come from the mountains. And I think what I learned from the very beginning, being from the mountains, is when you hike and when you want to go up the Pitzbalu, that differences don't matter anymore, because you have to rely on each other, man, woman, old, young, foreigner, not foreigner, you name it. And I think there is something to that. You know, we all are marked by where we come from. And in that sense, you know, for me, it has always been about equal partners on a mission. And whether that mission is a business undertaking or whether it's something else in life, that is the important thing. And each of us brings something unique to it. I have dedicated myself in the past 30 years in cross-fertilizing insights, many of them that stem from P&G, where I spent most of my time, but moving them from consumer goods into technical IT, SAP, for example, then moving it into optical, into fashion, my other job. Then as I moved into chairing and being a board member, into other areas, and latest in banking and private equity and investing, you know, in startups with venture capital. And it is fascinating how rich that cross-fertilization actually can be, how reapplicable many of the insights are, and how each of these industries has added on an insight that I think has made my approach to gender diversity richer, broader. And I would summarize it probably under the heading of, nowadays, gender diversity is not a program to make, you know, to develop more women into senior positions. That's a minute, small part of it. It is about how you look at the role of business today. What is its role in society and in value creation? And if you create value for all stakeholders, aka ESG, you know, there is an immediate role for gender diversity, among other sorts of diversity, in creating value for all stakeholders. And once you're there, I think, you know, a lot of the confusing conversation of 30 years ago is not needed anymore, because, you know, you go to the heart and the purpose of business and a particular company. In that sense, for me, the conclusion is very much that, you know, diversity is part of a sustainability agenda, and the sustainability agenda, in my view, is powered nowadays by digital and by, and there I get to the values that Paul was talking about, humanism. And I think humanism is something at IKEA, we talk about it. We talk about human-centered design. We talk about humanistic digital days that we're just having these 3 days here. I think that word, we shouldn't be afraid of really putting it in there, using it, and being clear what it can mean for each of us and for all our businesses.
So again, some great points and drawing out to humanism. But, you know, sometimes you have to start somewhere. And if I can inject a little of my own experience, I had actually gender balance very early in my career at P&G and in the UK and Germany. And as I became more senior and became the one and only woman on an ex-cohort board, I found that you know, I did feel a bit other. I did therefore what many women do, and ended up pivoting my career, perhaps because of my values, into social enterprise. And, you know, the irony is that CMI is all about many of the values that you spoke about, and about making people simply better line managers, turning accidental managers into conscious leaders. And really, that's what you're all saying that we all need to be. And I think that was something that P&G inherently understood and invested in. And I do think that gender balance aids that. So a couple of things we've done, CMI advised the government on measuring the gender pay gap, because we all know as business people, what gets measured gets done. And we particularly advise them to look at the percentages of women at every level of their organization, and some of the gaps, not only in pay, but bonuses. And some of the behaviors and values that you've all advocated really do start to become easier when you see you know, what percentage you have. As Paul said, you know, one of the first things he did was change things. So although I think it's absolutely vital that we do branch out into values, my own experience has been actually, whatever it is, it's a combination of measurement as well as those very solid values that really do matter. And I think that's also just an important point, is you've mentioned the business case here. There's an enormous business case for diversity and inclusion, gender as well. And we shouldn't forget that, because the data is overwhelming. Gender balance benefits everybody. So you've mentioned P&G and some shared experiences, that it's something that bonds us together. Was there a moment in your P&G career when you realized, you know, that this kind of value-centric and inclusive approach to leadership? And if so, maybe you could share that with us. Maybe there's a story there. Louisa, I'll start with you.
I think the seminal moment, as you just called it, Anne, I think was the sum of a series of moments. You know, over 20, almost 22 years, it's not one or the other. It's the sum that you don't realize when you're in it, but when you step back a few years later, you can actually see the total picture. And the moments are some extraordinary, insightful moments. Then there might be one or the other extraordinarily painful moment as well. And then one or the other funny one. So very quickly, I'll mention one of each really quickly. I think on the tremendously insightful ones, I think are probably two. I think the approach we took at the time, it was mid-90s, in really understanding why don't we have women. This was the time when there were no women beyond group managers, and the group managers were the laudable exceptions here and there. So a long time ago. And I think using our consumer-focused approach, data approach, quantitative and qualitative focus groups, and I was sent off to interview women across all EMEA who were and were not anymore with P&G. And I think that insightfulness of that exercise stayed with me since ever, because you would really find very technical barriers, flexibility in work arrangements and others. You would find very subtle barriers, very style and perception and interpretation of style type of areas. And solutions would be, as usual, in the consumer himself or herself, if you care to extrapolate what you really learned. So that always gave me an approach that's fact-based, very deep, very insightful, and then extracting things, and that stayed with me. The sad moment, or maybe more difficult one, was insights on how unchecked power works against gender diversity in terrible ways. And I will never forget a court case in the US where I was the key witness. That stayed with me very, very deeply when the judge asked me, why do you think this happened in a company like P&G? And I thought that was a moment of truth for me, and I'm sure also for everybody else who was in the courtroom. And then the funny ones, I mentioned Claude Maillard, and I do it with a lot of care and good memories, but he had never made a presentation on data on women representation, nor anything to do with women. We're talking here 97, I think, or 98. And it was very, very interesting when he looks to me and says, oh, this is just like getting to know a consumer study, isn't it? And I said, absolutely. There's nothing else more mystified about us than, we are like consumers. You just need to get to understand what makes us tick. And I thought that was lovely, and it stayed forever with me. The other one is Paul. I think once, Paul, in our quest in Europe, once we said, you get what you measure and what you reward, I think so much changed. That's it from my side.
So that's great. So we do want to have time for questions. So we're coming up to about 13 minutes left of our total time. So I want to ask Paul and then Jane, really quickly, maybe your seminal P&G story, and really have a time for a couple of questions from our audience. So Paul?
Yeah, no, thank you, Luisa, and it obviously reflects your work that you did then. But my moment, perhaps, I don't know if there was a moment like Luisa, you form yourself continuously, and I'm still working on that. But the one thing that came to mind most strikingly as I heard you talk was actually in Newcastle. I'd come from Spain, not known to be a gender-friendly country in the 90s when I was working there. And I moved to Newcastle, and two things happened to me. Replacing my clasper, I got involved in the community activities. And I felt that was a moment that I moved from being a half person, self-centered, career, results, playing the corporate game, to a full person. It was the first time that I saw second generation unemployment, shipbuilding, coal, steel, all had gone belly up. And we would meet people and see them, and in all the cities around the coast, that the only thing a girl could get when she was 14 or 15 years old was pregnant and have a baby. It was all the complications coming out of that. So it really made me realize of how we really need to work hard as a company. And we were the biggest employer there on the River Tyne, how we need to ensure that it's working for everybody. And then my management board, they were super, incredible experience, fun, professional, but they were all male. They all belonged to the male-only golf club, things I'd frankly never seen in my life, but it still existed up north. So you had this dichotomy of inclusion with separation. Business doing well, but it could never do well in the long term if we were not better reflecting that society. So what I liked about P&G, I have to say, is the rigor, the targets, the comprehensiveness of the plans, but you can only win if you do it with the heart and with the head. And as Louise knows, there's only one time in my life I refused a bonus, because when we made so much progress in Europe, A.G. Lovely came and said, we have to reward you. You've done a great job. Gender diversity has been advanced. Here is some money. And I said, I'm not taking this, because you will never get there if you buy off with money what we should be doing in the first place as being right. We should actually fire the people that don't do it. And that concept, I think, took a long time for P&G to understand. If you truly want to change the behavior and the values, you don't reward what we all need to do. You get rid of the people that after a certain time and with all your tools don't get it. It's perhaps a little bit harsh, but it is effective, I can tell you. And this is what we did at Unilever.
So that's an amazing story. And I know when I interviewed you for my book, you shared that story. And I think it's an incredibly powerful anecdote. And you're right. I agree with it. Jane, what is your experience? Can you share your story?
Yes, well, my seminal moment was the day I left P&G, I think, because I was very privileged, honestly, in my young career. I was in a very dynamic part, a very diverse part of P&G at that time, health and beauty care, and there were tremendous female role models all around me, including you, Anne. And also tremendous leaders. I worked for Gavin Patterson, Tim Penner, who really championed diversity and put that at the heart of the values. So honestly, I think I was one of those women who, in Jill Whitty-Collins' recent book, Why Men Win at Work, she called out women who deny there's an issue. And I think, honestly, as I grew up in P&G, I didn't recognize there was an issue in my early stages of my career. And it wasn't till the day I left. And I did join Mars, which is a wonderful company. But I realized on my first week at Mars, I'd asked all the wrong questions about diversity, because I'd asked things like, what's your policies? What I didn't realize is the day I landed, and I remember, Anne, it was in a room with you in Brussels. I think it was the top 80 leaders in Europe. And I was one of 4 women in the room. And, look, it's a tremendous experience we've built over time. But I think, it was through some of that experience and through stopping being self-centered, but also looking out into other industries, really working with our agency partners, working with our value chain, Paul, as you said, right to the farmers, our cocoa farmers, our rice farmers, and understanding that gender equality is not something, diversity is not something that everybody has the privilege to experience. And I'm really grateful to my first years at P&G, but my seminal moment was the day I left.
Yeah, and that
I took it for granted.
That is a great point. And I do, on that point, before we go to questions, you've talked about humanity. When I was at P&G, and Jane, that time you referenced, I was going through a divorce. I had to take my daughter to school, and that made me late every day for the daily management meeting. And the general manager at that time, who is with us here tonight, Chris De La Puente, said, don't even think about it. Take your kid to school. It's the right thing to do. And of course I was embarrassed walking in late to that meeting. Of course I was, but we all got used to it. And then I paid it forward. I let all of my guys fit their work around their lives. And now we fast forward all these decades later, and that has become such a key, important component. So look, you guys have been absolutely awesome. I know we could spend the whole night with you, but I do want to get at least a question. Okay, I'm going to pick a question here from Ramsey. There's wisdom to be gained from the lessons of failure, if not as much or more from success. So what have you learned from your biggest failure? Who wants to go first on that? I don't know. Luisa, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I couldn't agree more. I don't think one learns from success, not even half of what one learns from failure. And I have learned this in recruiting nowadays, particularly in the private equity sector. I think I look for people who have failed and failed well, okay? I think what I've learned from my biggest failure is the power of a cultural context. And I think it's easy when you come from a P&G context to think that, certain values are kind of human values and common sense is kind of common and so on. And I think particularly when you're long at P&G, and I think it's really, really important, in my view, what I've learned is get your context fully understood. And that's what I apply nowadays in investing, for example, with due diligence, the cultural aspects of it. And they are not just nationally driven, they're also nationally driven. And frankly, for somebody who is a bit of a gypsy like me, I tend to underplay national differences because I ride on the commonalities. I think you have to take the time, the patience, and go deep into the cultural whys and historical whys to address them to drive change effectively and sustainably.
That's a great answer. Paul, what have you learned from your failure?
Yeah, sorry, let me unmute. Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is probably setting the bar too low, incrementalism. That is, we celebrate a 1% improvement. We should be doing 5 or 10. It takes 257 years, even before COVID, to get gender equality, if you want to, on the WEF index. And COVID the pandemic itself has added another 25 or 30 years. So we celebrate incrementalism, we don't make progress. That is really a failure from all of us, myself included. The second thing is that we don't see it comprehensively. At some points in my career, I was so focused on the gender because that was the rallying cry of the day, but you cannot do that and disregard racial, as we have seen with the George Floyd tragedies, or not work on people with disabilities, which are close to my heart. So I've made that same mistake. It has to be inclusive if you want to. And then the third one is ignorance. Most of my mistakes come from ignorance. If I would have listened a little bit more, if I would have understood the situation more, you could have put the right remedies in place. So I'd say those are the three: incrementalism, not holistically looking at it, and being simply ignorant.
So very powerful stuff. Jane, what have you learned from your failures?
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say to listen more. I think the biggest failures are when you become too attached to an idea and you don't look broadly enough. You don't really listen. You don't listen with empathy. So driving back to your humanistic point, what is active listening? It's not just hearing, it's empathizing. It's putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think for me, my biggest failure is when I haven't really developed that empathy. I've just listened, heard, and written it down in my notebook.
So look, we are running out of time. I'm going to ask you like a rapid fire question. Each of you, maybe 30 seconds. What's the one thing you advise our audience to really make sure that COVID does not become a major she session? And just a really quick thing. What do they need to do? I'll start with you, Paul.
As I mentioned already, COVID is very interesting. In some parts of the world, actually, the male employment has gone up, but the female employment has gone down. It has set us back about 10, 15 years on the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is very bizarre because we've discovered, for example, that 70% of the people that are in healthcare and provide services to us, etc., are women. We've also seen that domestic help and, on the other hand, violence and all these issues have gone up. And they are, again, 3 times more unpaid work than paid work. So the most important thing that we now need to do is that as we try to come out of this terrible disaster, as we try to build a society that is more equitable, more sustainable, more inclusive, that in all of the plans that we put in place, with the G20 that I'm working, with the G7, with the COP26 on climate, with the Biodiversity Convention, the Food Summit that is taking place, a very important year, 2021, of an agenda that now the US is back on board. Be sure that in all of these things that we do, that we take the gender aspect not only into account, but actually overcompensate for that. Otherwise, we will never get there. And that's the priority, one of the priorities for myself for 2021. That's
super to hear. So really quick, rapid fire answer. One thing to do, Jane, what is it? What do we need to do to
Okay, look, there's many challenges, but I think what we've learned through COVID is there's many opportunities too. So I normally live on a plane, travel 75% of my time. And I think, we've learned in the last year to work flexibly, to work mission-based teams. So I say, let's create a new normal, a better normal, and double down on the things that have worked, that has perhaps surprised many leaders, that can enable more diversity in our work.
Fabulous point. And Luisa, your final top quick tip.
I close with a quote from Ingvar Kamprad, the person who probably inspired me most to do things I thought I wouldn't be able to do and do different things. He always said that every crisis must make us stronger. That has certainly proven true for IKEA every single time, including this time. And I think it should be the case for us personally, because in crisis, our weaknesses become naked, and it's the moment to address them and drive them, otherwise they kill us, whether that's in business, in a company, in a startup, whether it's you personally, and I think it's for society as well. So let's make sure that this terrible crisis makes us stronger. And I think a few of the topics you both said, I think I agree with. But the mindset, I think, is super important.
So what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Some great wisdom. You guys, thank you so much. I wish we had all night. Unfortunately, we don't, and we've got to march on to our next event.